In this video, we'll take a look at Singer's pond case. So I said in class and in a previous video that the moral principle Singer offers here, and I've got the qualified version in my argument map, is one of the major claims being argued for in the paper. So let's look at the paragraph again where this claim gets introduced to see if we've been offered any reasons for it yet. So here we get a statement of the claim. Then he explains what exactly the claim means. So this is just clarificatory remarks. They aren't reasons for accepting the claim, they're just clarifications of the claim. He says it seems uncontroversial. It requires only this, not that. That's just, again, clarifying what exactly the claim is saying. He suggests we could actually qualify it. This is a weaker claim, and it would still apply and require quite a lot of us, it turns out. And then we get, last sentence, an application of this principle would be as follows. Pond case. So question, how does this pond case fit into Singer's argument? I'm going to flag that as a general question of interest because references to the pond case come up again later in the paper, and it seems to be used as an analogy to the Bengal case and in general to cases where people are dying and suffering from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. So I'm just going to leave this as something to consider throughout my attempt to map the argument. But for now, I do want to know, does anything about this case directly support this premise? Okay, so if I just write pond example, that's not very helpful. So if I read this, here's this principle, if blah, 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 then morally we ought to do it. Why think that? Well, pond example. What is that example and what about it? I'm going to add the actual text as a note here. And this is in paragraph 6. So he says, if I'm walking past a shallow pond and I see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this isn't significant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. He says explicitly that an application of this principle, so this is an application of the principle to a case. Okay, so here are the facts of the case. A child is drowning, you can save the child, and presumably if you do, and let's just fill in the details, you'll muddy your clothes and shoes, maybe even ruin them. And in later versions of this case, in different papers, Singer asks us to imagine that in this case, you're wearing fancy shoes, shoes that cost maybe like $200, and if you wade in to save the child, you're going to get them muddy, and you'll be out a $200 pair of shoes. And no, you can't quick take them off before you jump in. Time is of the essence. So build that into the case so that the facts of the case are a child is drowning, you can save the child, and if you do, you're going to muddy your $200 shoes and ruin them. Those are just the facts. What's the argument? So reasoning in a parallel way, we've got the case about something being bad. The child's drowning would be a bad thing. So the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. Check. It is in your power to prevent the child from drowning. You can wade into shallow ponds. It's a thing you have the power to do. And you can prevent the child's drowning without sacrificing something morally significant. Yes, you have to sacrifice something, your $200 fancy shoes, but that's not morally significant. And if we use the stronger version, it's definitely not morally comparable to the life of a child. Okay, so those are the first three premises, and then this principle says if it's in your power to prevent something bad from happening, the child's drowning, without sacrificing anything morally significant, and you can do that, the only thing you'd have to sacrifice is your shoes, and that's not morally significant, and it is in your power to do so, then you ought to do it. You ought to save that drowning child. That's the conclusion of this case. You ought to save this child. It would be wrong for you to just watch the child drown and say something like, I don't want to muddy my shoes. What do you expect me to do? So that is the strong claim here. So what does this do as far as support for this premise? It might just be an illustration of the premise. This principle is a premise in the argument. It might be an illustration of this principle, in which case it's not a reason. I'm just helping you to see how it would apply in a concrete case. Alternatively, the fact that this principle explains why it would be wrong for you to just walk by and not save a child drowning because you value your fancy shoes. If it explains why that is, that might be support for this principle. Think about that. Now, importantly, he is assuming that you're going to agree that if you were to walk by a child drowning in a shallow pond, no risk to yourself whatsoever in rescuing this child, the only thing you'd have to give up is your shoes, which are worth $200 in this case, that it would be wrong for you to not do that. So if you accept that, then you might wonder, why is it wrong for me not to do that? And here's an answer. Because if it's in your power to prevent something really bad from happening, and you could do that without giving up anything morally significant, and you don't, then you've done something really bad. It would be wrong not to do it when you could without giving up anything. So this principle could explain why you ought to save the child. And if it does explain it, and it provides a really good explanation, maybe even the best explanation, that would count as a reason to support this. Okay, so let's just put this in as possible justification. This principle explains why you ought to rescue the child in the pond example, and why it would be wrong not to do that. Now, this could use a co-premise. There's usually a co-premise lurking to connect a single premise to a conclusion. What might it be in this case? Can you identify it? In this case, maybe it's something like being applicable to a concrete case, or being able to explain why we ought to do whatever it is we ought to do in concrete cases is evidence for the truth of a principle. So this is something that I'm definitely reading into the argument. I'm making sense of the argument I've been given here. So all we've been told is, here's an application, and he doesn't even spell out how exactly it applies. And it's pretty obvious. I mean, we can easily figure it out ourselves. And at the very least, it just helps to illustrate what the argument is, but possibly, and this is us being interpretive and using something like the principle of charity, where we're trying to develop the strongest argument possible and make sense of the argument, which takes intellectual work. Something like this could be used to support the claim being made. But really, this is sort of just, if we're looking at what he's actually written, this is sort of an offhand remark at this point, and it's not his main strategy for arguing for the principle. So maybe this goes in your argument map, maybe it doesn't. And if you want to, you can hide a node, or maybe you can't. I guess you can hide levels, not single branches within the same level. So never mind, we can't hide this. So that might be a reason to just move it off to the side of your map, or to make a mental note of it, or leave it, whatever you want to do. Now, something to consider. So we said that this principle does potentially explain why it is you ought to save the child, and it would be wrong not to, if you think that's true. And most people confronted with this case do think you ought to save the child, and it would be wrong not to. Is this why? One thing you might do in arguing against this principle and this application as either an illustration of the principle or potentially a support for it is to come up with some other principle that explains why you should pull the child out of the water and it would be wrong not to. Because one of the things he's going to argue, and it seems like this is used as an analogy throughout the case, so there is some argument from analogy here, is that the structure of the argument for why you ought to save that child is identical to the structure of the argument for why you ought to prevent death and suffering from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. And if there's a difference between these two, if you think, yes, you ought to save the child and it would be wrong not to. However, it is not wrong for you to not spend time and money and a good deal of effort trying to prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. If you think one is wrong but not the other, what is the morally relevant difference between those cases? Because this principle seems to apply equally to this case and to the preventing suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care case. So one thing you might do is try to identify morally relevant differences between these two cases, this case and the suffering from death and lack of food, shelter, and medical care case, such that this principle either ought to be qualified so that it says, yes, you ought to save the child drowning, but it doesn't actually apply to the hunger, starvation, death, and suffering from lack of food, shelter, and medical care cases. So there is some morally relevant difference, and that's another way to look at what is happening throughout the argument. What qualifications or changes to this principle or alternative principles might be in play such that it's not actually this principle that's in play and it's not actually the case that this conclusion follows after all. Okay, so feel free to set this one aside and focus your efforts on the arguments that a Singer focuses on them. And another thing you might do is just try to map bits of the argument, the parts that seem to clearly go together. Don't worry about connecting it all in one big map. Start wherever you see arguments happening. Be on the lookout for indicator language that helps you see how bits of reasoning come together. It's complicated. This isn't an easy case. And feel free to collaborate on this. Post whether it's a question or whether you have mapped one paragraph, just one paragraph of this case, and you're curious if your bit of the argument is right. Feel free to share your map by posting it in the Slack Collaborate channel. You can do that either by sharing your file if you have it hooked up to your Google Maps, or just hitting save and sharing the address in the address bar as well. So there's two ways to easily share your maps, or you can download it as an image or a PDF and post it to Slack. That way it's really easy to share files. So sharing your map should be super easy. Okay, I look forward to seeing how you choose to map this, or even bits of it. And I do hope people share bits to the Collaborate file, because I'll be happy to look at what you've done and comment on it, and hopefully we can, as a class, get the whole thing mapped. Okay, good luck.